Okay, should be up now. So I think I only had one main thing from my side, which was we're trying to cancel as the obviously KubeCon we wouldn't have this meeting. We're looking to cancel next week's meeting as well, so that folks have time to prepare for KubeCon. Um, so I think the next time we meet after today will be the 26th. And I think we were chatting during the main meeting call yesterday. I think the plan is Path will kind of write up a scope for the project and project timeline and things like that that we can discuss. And the hope also is that we're going to get a huge influx of people that'll be coming in after KubeCon. So there'll be kind of like meet and greet. Hopefully, you can get a little bit more people chiming in on the issues and see kind of gauge enthusiasm and drive things forward. So would be a good time to capture that group of collaborators. I think today just we actually part that's gonna talk about the project. Anything
Yep.
else from other folks?
Yeah, so there's one thing from my end. So I did invite Ashley from who's been doing some of the stuff on the cert manager side, who at least there's some interest potentially for us to start to look at like applying supply chain security rules to something like what they're doing on that end, as well as potentially, you know, running it through something like a secure software factory or whatever. Gave him a little bit of a rundown, but just wanted to also sort of invite him in if there was just like a couple of minutes where he wanted to kind of chat through some of that.
Awesome. Actually, how long do you think you need for that? Just want to make sure we have enough time in the agenda.
I mean, I don't need a great deal of time or anything. It's just sort of an initial chat and sort of see how things are going. I've got maybe a couple of questions about SLSA on a general level, but I don't know if they need to be in this meeting or not. This is a bit last minute for me, so I don't really have an estimate or anything.
All right, fair enough. Shripa, do you think can leave like maybe 10, 15 minutes?
Yeah. I think I'll take maybe 15 to 20 minutes. So I think we should.
Okay,
do it.
perfect. Yeah. Awesome. Going around the room, anything else? If not, we'll go ahead with Shripa's presentation.
Yeah, I just had one question on the white paper. So, do you think is it going to get out before KubeCon?
So, so it's with lockdown. I've kicked out everyone from from editing or commenting on this document now. So they did have a draft, which looks really nice, of kind of the print version. No matter whether or not we get a new print version of the revised content, I think we should still have a blog post and still announce it then, because it is really we should have the markdown version on the repo at least to point to people.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think for the blog post, probably Michael and I can work together on just having one up, and then we'll ship it to CNCF.
Okay. So should we go to the presentation? Let me start sharing.
Go for it.
Okay. Yeah. So this was the project. So I basically mentor this project at Boston University every semester. So last fall semester, this was the project that we started. It's called Project Jonah. I still don't know how we came up with that name. And I want to basically give a shout out to these team members, right? So they are basically the students, the graduate student. They have been working on this. And we had basically the initial version, which is open source. So I'll just post the link in the chat. And this was part of their course project, so we didn't have much time to work on it. But then after their course project, we have been doing some extension that I will talk about. So let me start sharing. So what was the problem that we are trying to solve, right? So if you look into the build process, right? So a developer declares dependency and define a build recipe, typically Docker file, right? And we have a lot of pre-built analysis that we do in our DevSecOps. We scan dependencies, we scan this file, identify any issues, right? And then we perform builds, right? Then once we satisfy with all these checks and everything, we go in the build process. And then once the build process typically produce an OCI image, right? And it can be a binary or anything. But in this case, just think of it like an OCI image. And then we do a lot of post-build scanning. We scan the build artifact or vulnerabilities or any other checks. Now in this whole spectrum, the build essentially is, at this moment, is a black box, right? So during build, it might download some dependencies, or it is actually following the recipe, and it is doing the actual actions and compiling and everything, and preparing our deployment image. So that's essentially what we are trying to do. Like there is a lack of transparency in the build, and there's a lack of trust. If you think of it like a SolarWinds, right? If the build server is compromised, someone can easily inject some binary or some malicious code into it. So we want to basically bring this out. Like we want to have this some attestation and some insight into whole build process. So that's how we started thinking of, okay, what we wanted to do. We wanted to basically create a build fingerprint. And the way we want to do is essentially monitor build process, right? We monitor build process, you create attestation of system activity records and associate it with the build actions, right? So there is no value just creating a log file of all the syscall that are made and just saying, okay, this was what happened during the build. It's not useful. We need to basically identify the sections of that records that associate to the individual build actions. Like if you think of a Docker file, right? It has a run or copy or from. For every action in the build process, what are the associated system activities? We want it to do that. Then support different build patterns, right? We have a Docker build, there are Kaneko, build packs, builder, and different, and they follow different ways of building. And why it is important, we'll go into details when I'll explain it later. And then create a unique fingerprint for a build, right? That we can basically use for a couple of use cases that again we'll discuss later, and also see how we can link it and incorporate it into the SBOM. And because SBOM currently doesn't have a way to save. It has some properties which says how you install the dependencies, but people are using the PURL for that, which is essentially the package URL. It doesn't have any way to link any attestations of this activity. So we are trying to see how we can link it to the SBOM and animate. So going into individual process, right? So monitor, we said, okay, we want to monitor.
I have a clarification question. You said system calls, just like recording the system calls, is not that useful. So when you say system activity, what are you exactly referring to?
System activities, it's basically a system call, but just giving a list of system calls is not useful, right? So if you say there is a stat or fopen or open or close, we don't want to do just create that. We want to say what are the number of files created, what are the sizes of the file that have been created. So
okay.
Some basically semantic understanding of those system activities, right? Yeah, like if there is a network connection, just telling there is this system call, instead of telling that, we say there is a egress connection to that, right? That user can easily recognize and associate it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So we said, okay, we want to monitor the activities. So we started with the eBPF. We said we'll basically create hooks into build system And this is important. We are basically hooking into the whole system activities, right? So it's not, we don't know individual build process. And then we create a system records. We get basically this, all the activities that are happening, like egress connections and files access and everything. Now the challenge here was, again, as I said, it creates this big list of all system activities, which is again not useful. And as I said, our objective was to basically link these system activities to individual actions in the in our build recipe, like in the Docker file. When you run this run curl this command, it actually does this activity. It goes and connect to this particular IP, it create this file with this size, it download that file at or on target and everything. So we wanted to link this together. And this was not trivial. I mean, with eBPF, we can monitor and get the record, but then how do you link this, create these associations together? The next thing we did, we basically added a proc monitor. We started, I mean, eBPF gives us for this system call was made by this particular process ID, right? We said, okay, now we'll monitor the PI processes on the system, and we'll see which are essentially spawned from basically Docker daemon. And that's how this, earlier I said we need to support different build system. This is essentially the reason, right? Because different build patterns, build system like Docker or Perico, they follow different ways of handling build processes. So right now we are supporting Docker build, right? So that's what the process monitor does. It basically identifies the process ID that are spawned from the Docker daemon, the shim layer, and then we basically resolve those process IDs, right, with the system activities that we record from eBPF. So now when eBPF says that PID this actually made this particular connection, we know that particular PID has this command name from the proc table, and then this PID belongs to this particular process, build process. So that was the non-trivial part during this. The other option we consider here is, instead of doing this out of band, like this analysis, can we wrap it, basically create a wrapper around build? Like instead of saying Docker build, we can say Jonah build, and now we know every process that is spawned is coming from our parent process, right? And that would simplify this analysis. But then that essentially means that we need to change all existing system. We need to build a wrapper that we didn't want it to do. We wanted it to be build agnostic, right? You don't change anything, you just deploy this system and it will create this attestations for you. So this was an interesting exercise that we had to basically do on top of just the plain records coming from eBPF. Right? And then finally, we basically had this records coming from eBPF or process proc resolver. We collect them, we filter them. There are a lot of duplicates records, so we filter them, and then finally we generate some report, right? So the report, so this is essentially I put it in the GitHub issue also. So it simplifies. It says these are the build steps. If you run this command, there is a network activity egress. It goes to this particular IP. These are the files created, and these are the resources, how much time, memory, CPU it actually use during execution. Yeah. And so, yeah, so once we generate this record, next thing is essentially how do we use it, right? So where do we use this records? So one is build compliant. So if we have CISO policies that during build, we don't want any network access, anything going outside our network, our private network, right? So we can essentially collect this fingerprint, and we can analyze it to basically identify any network connections or any activities that are trying to reach the network. Or if we have a list of basically blocked IPs, malicious IPs from repudiation database, then we can compare it against those, right? We can say, are we making any network connection, network access to some of these known blocked IPs, right? That can be basically one use case that can be built on top of the data that we have collected. And then second is anomaly detection, right? So first is create a golden fingerprint. Like we run this in our sandbox or on a trusted environment. We said, when I run a build, this is the fingerprint I expect, right? With some network access pattern. The IP address is we cannot compare against the exact IP address because it will change. So a lot of time when we download any dependencies, if we are reaching to the internet downloading it, we hit some mirror, right? So, but we want to basically identify the patterns. Again, exact number of files or what files have been created, I think that we didn't find that is much useful. So we are basically saying identify what number of files have been created, deleted, modified, what are the sizes of file, and create some fingerprint, right? So out of it. And again, this is something that we just came up with, and it's not, if people have some thoughts or inputs, I think we really appreciate anything. And finally, the resource usage, right? So it's a mirror margin, right? So typically when I run a build, it takes let's say 0.8 CPU core of the CPU, and it uses 100 megabytes of memory. Now I at least know some in some ballpark that what these resources look like. And when I suddenly sees for some build the resources is very high, then I at least have some indicator, right? Like some signal that tells me, okay, I need to go and look into this build more closely. That is something bad happened because this is an abnormal behavior. That's one way we can identify the anomaly against golden fingerprint, or we can run, we can use it against basically peer anomaly detections, right? So I can run two builds in parallel and get their fingerprint and measure what are the, if they match and if they have the similarity between them. So these are basically a few use cases that we are basically trying to build on top of it. And then few areas that we are still exploring is how do we integrate with In-Toto, right? In-Toto gives us the layout. So if can we represent the Docker file into In-Toto layout and then basically create attestation for them. Sign attestation of fingerprint, I think this is going to be pretty straightforward. We'll basically be signing it and attaching it to the image. And again, as I said, the SBOM, right? How do we align this work with SBOM? Where does it fit into the SBOM spec, or how do we link it to the SBOM, right? So these are essentially a few areas that we still are basically working through. So this is what all I had. Actually, I couldn't get the I didn't have this working demo at the moment, but I think in a couple of weeks post KubeCon, we can do the demo of this work as well. Any questions? So yeah, so I think the work that I think it is the initial version is open source, and now this was in some program in Python that we built, but now we are basically working and making it in Go, and we are extending these new services and new use cases on top of it. So that we will basically be open sourcing it once it is working end to end. We basically plan to update this with that new version. Yeah, I think that's pretty much what I had. Any questions? Any thoughts?
Cool. That looks very neat. Actually, one of the questions I have is, do you think that this could sort of fit into one of the gaps in sort of the secure software factory, like running something like, I don't know, like for example, the runtime visibility piece?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, I mean, I had a counter question that, yeah, I want to basically see if we can present it into SSF working group, right? So yeah, I think it definitely fits into what we wrote in the paper and what we thought we discussed in the recently. So it definitely fits there. So yeah, if you have any suggestions, let me know. I'll basically happy to get some more inputs and see how it fits with the SSF. Or what is the new name? FRC? I don't know how you pronounce it.
Oh, just Fresca, I think is the.
Fresca, okay. Yeah. I wanted to attend yesterday, but I didn't. I had conflict. But yeah, next week, or if you have some time in agenda, let me know. I'll be happy to present it.
Sure, sounds good.
Can you talk a little bit more about the sign attached to the fingerprint? Like, what did you mean by that?
Yeah, so let me actually show. So the way we actually did sharing. Okay. So the way if you go into this. So the current implementation is essentially we create this report, the JSON report, and we sign it, and using ORAS, we basically attach it to the image. But going forward, our idea was, since we are basically attesting each action, right? Each action in the Docker file with some system activities. So if we have some Interto layout for that, if we can create a layout out of it, then we can basically sign those that layout attestation, right, as is. So user can essentially verify that, because it says this command should be run in this particular order, and these are the activities that it performed. But how exactly it looks like, yeah, we didn't had, as I said, it's something that we still need to work through. So maybe with Santiago, we'll probably need some inputs from him how we can do it. But at this moment, we basically just signing that blob, the JSON, and we are attaching it to the image, build image. Right? So it's a new attachment to the image. So that's what we had.
I think that's when you do the ORAS attach, that's the artifact spec from ORAS. So that requires the updated registry. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, in this particular demo, I think we just use the local registry. So I don't know if a lot of registry, they already support this. But
at present, they're like 2 or 3.
Yeah, exactly. So we just spin up our own local registry, and we are able to attach it and work with it. But yeah, this was our initial basically implementation. But again, this is not something. What if you have any inputs? I think we definitely want to see that that is a gap at what do we attest and how do we sign that.
So the other question I had was, could this be added into like the in total provenance? Right.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah. Once we agree on what do we sign, right? I mean, what the layout looks like and what do we attest in that in the Interto provenance? What exactly we are attesting? Then we can essentially use it for all Interto protocols like Interto sign, Interto provenance, and record, verify, and everything. Yep. So do we have? Yeah.
I have one question about the outputs of that run. How complicated is it for someone to review it and say this looks valid?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's not going to be machine. I mean, it's not. We are not expecting it to be human readable, right? I mean, they can review it, but they probably won't be able to make most out of it. I mean, even if it's a the egress connection to this particular IP, this thing, it has to be machine verifiable, right? So use that and use the additional threat intelligence like blocked IP or some comparison to the other build, and just get the signal, right? Like true, false, some indications like this build doesn't look good. If you just look into that JSON file, it is like maybe 200, 300 lines of code for typical build. Manually verifying it, I don't think it would be that useful. So we are still expecting that it will be consumed by machines and will be used for basically to get some signals, generate some signals.
Gotcha.
So Michael, do you want to schedule it in the SSF working group sometime?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So let me just this. Yeah, because and I'll also link the issue as well in the chat here in a second. Once I find in my huge list of Google Docs, which one is the one for the thing here. Give me 1 second. There we go.
Shripad, question, could this be added to like Tekton itself, or like an integration within Tekton, so that that's especially, as it's running with chains, right, it's creating the attestation, this is a, other attestation that gets added on top of it or combined with it or something?
Yes. So chains is doing attestation of the Tekton actions themselves, right? So this is going one level deeper. Like
Deeper, right.
When you run what for each actions created. So I see it going to be, it's sitting next to Tekton as some additional controller, which is monitoring all system activity and not specific to Tekton, because it's agnostic to Tekton also, right? It just say, okay. I mean, ideally it should be agnostic to anything. I can run Jenkins build anywhere I run it. It should be able to basically just create attestation out of it.
Quick question on the level of privileges and like kernel modules and stuff like that. What's required to do the instrumentation for it?
Yeah, don't think we had to have, we had to give a lot of permissions. So I don't know if we are documented or I have a list of it. But I think the hook we created was for the TCP end, TCP close, and F entry, right? So 2 hooks, and I don't think we needed any special privileges sort of for this. But I don't have the exact detail on it. I can basically ping you or post it in the channel.
Yeah,
yeah.
I was thinking along like what Path was saying, right? It's kind of like if we can put this as part of the entry point, the like flow in Tekton, then you could already kind of have the information available.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so that's something we should probably chat through with some of the stuff that we're trying to do with the tool soon to be formally known as SSF. We're trying to figure out like, hey, how do we want like, does it make sense for the tools themselves to, let's say, wrap itself? Does it make sense to sort of try and integrate with other things to sort of say those other things wrap something like Jonah, to where what Jonah is doing, something else goes out and signs it, and generates the attestation of what Jonah is generating? I think there's some open questions there. I think from which would be interesting from like a hypothetical, like not a true threat model, but just like a high level, just, hey, if somebody were to go and compromise Jonah, how would that get caught? Right.
Yeah.
I think that would be interesting to just sort of chat through.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I have the opinion that anyone who is generating something, they should attest it themselves, right? So even it should not be the 2-step process that I create something, some record, and pass it somewhere and they attest. It should be atomic operations, like so like people today their SBOM generation is separate from SBOM signing, which doesn't make sense. So it should be an atomic operation. So if you trust that tool, then your basically trust is localized. You just trust that one tool. If you're separating this 2-step, then you want to trust multiple entities. Like I want to trust the Jonah to generate it. I want to trust that it was properly handled by the other tool. It was not modified, and the other tool also I need to trust it, that it's signed properly. But yeah, I think
I actually am thinking the opposite, because I know it, like in a lot of the salsa discussions we have, that isolation is important, because the tool that you're using to generate the thing, unless you can generate it in a way that you're not influenced by the input, if you are able to get arbitrary code execution on that particular action, you can sign whatever you want.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah,
I guess I had a question about that then. Where is it really like 2 steps where we have raw intelligence and then we have behavioral attestators. So, you know, maybe a large company or small companies would have different reasons to attest it in different ways, based on the monitoring that's going on, whether you're using some commercial solution that eventually plugs in, says, yeah, we've used all
Is
our.
it me or did we cut off?
I don't know.
It might be. It might be just you. I was able to hear. Okay.
Yeah, so we use all our AI from, you know, whatever we're using, and we said, yeah, those fingerprints look good, and then that's all like we care about, or you know, or we have think I guess. I'm thinking.
Yeah. So, I think it's going to be, you know, a lot of it's going to be highly dependent on the risk appetite of the project and the organization, how they kind of want to do it. I think some of it's also going to evolve over time. I think right now, you know, there's going to be, I think, a combination of things depending on the various needs of the various projects. But I think that, like, for example, there might be a whole bunch of projects that are like, hey, we're generically building, you know, Java stuff. So we might, and the stuff that we're building from Java perspective might be like extraordinarily varied, thousands and thousands of pipelines and those sorts of things. And there might be, you know, more of a loose fitting model of like, hey, let's try and find where the bad stuff is and that sort of thing. Whereas I can imagine, you know, like, and this is actually something that had done in a sort of a previous life, is like, there might be times when you're like, hey, this is a very secure build. I am pretty much, as opposed to doing a deny list, I'm doing only an allow list here and being like very, very rigorous on how that policy kind of operates. And so I'm not using, let's say, ML to kind of detect weird stuff. I'm pretty much saying like, this build should only do these 3 specific things, and if it tries to do anything else, fail the build and alert the security team. I think it is an interesting problem that I think is going to be highly dependent on the organization or project. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was what I was getting at with like turning the dial up with the attester. Maybe the intelligence, the raw signals don't change, but the tester changes. I don't know. It's salsa levels maybe, but.
Oh yeah, and I think these are things that are also being discussed on the salsa side as well, which is just like, there's probably levels there, you know, there's going to inevitably be things that like, and this is a thing that was discussed with a few groups, like you might imagine that a open source, you know, sorry, not a, like an organization, you know, that they're geared around sort of intelligence and, you know, they do a lot of scans on their own and they figure out a lot of that information. You know, there's going to be stuff that is available to open source. There's going to be stuff that is only available for pay and whatever. And I think there's going to be a combination of these things, you know, depending on who you are and what your risk profile is, right? You know, how deep down that rabbit hole you go.
Yeah. Okay.
Cool. So I can't tell if Brendan got if Brendan's internet or whatever kicked him off. I can't see him on my Zoom anymore. Oh no,
He
wait.
commented that no audio for him.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, weird. It's like I see a box there, but it doesn't have his thing. Whatever. So I think the next topic we wanted to kind of go over, or actually, let me just. Is there any other open questions? Otherwise, we can kind of move on to the next topic. All right. Cool. So the next topic was. I know we have we had a couple of different proposals for some work from the SBOM stuff, from you know, runtime and some of these other things. and one of the ones was, hey, is there like a CNCF project that we can maybe start to apply the best practices to? See if there's a way to run it through a secure software factory or whatever. And one of the things from the security tag perspective is Cert Manager kind of was like, hey, we're trying to start to follow Salsa. We're trying to do some of this stuff. Is there things that we can, and they wanted to better understand Salsa and understand, the supply chain best practices. And I think it's maybe a good fit for, some sort of collaboration here. I had kind of already brought this up previously to Ashley here, that hey, the idea here is more of a partnership, not necessarily that we are enforcing rules right now upon them and saying you must, your build must look like this. It's more of like, hey, this is what your build looks like today. Here's where we would suggest you move, like where here's things that you should probably add or remove or whatever. And help, like literally with hands on keyboard, let's help out here. And if there are areas that like, no, we don't want to do this thing, maybe it makes sense to, figure out where the gaps are, what might be challenging to get some of those higher level Salsa, and so on. Ashley, do you want to kind of chat a little bit about some of that?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you for inviting me. It's been super interesting to be part of so far. I guess like a partnership sounds really good, right? I'm not the sole decision maker on the Cert Manager project or anything like that, but I'm certainly keen, and I'm sure like with my Cert Manager hat on, I'm sure the Cert Manager project is keen. With my JetStack hat on, sort of where most of the Cert Manager maintainers happen to work, they would be super keen as well. And I think Salsa seems like the way that this sort of stuff will end up going. It seems like the obvious choice for us to sort of pursue, and it seems pretty worthwhile if we're sort of the guinea pigs on this kind of thing. Like I think we'd be happy to be in that role and sort of like try things out, see where we bump into things. My only real concern with that would be that a lot of Cert Manager's build system was made sort of years ago and was arguably maybe a little bit overcomplicated for what it needed to be. It's quite custom in places. And so it might be difficult to apply some of the things we might have to change more generally to other projects. But that said, I mean, at its core, it's Google Cloud Build running fairly standard Go build commands, and there will definitely be learning stuff there. I think from my perspective as a project maintainer, what I'm looking for in the very short term is like the place to be directed to the place where I can ask questions about Salsa, say, like to find out if I'm looking at a given requirement and I don't think we can match it, or I don't know if anything can match it, maybe in some cases. Like, where do I ask about that? Who do I ask about that? What's the sort of place to go? I'm not really sure at the moment. Yeah,
well, I mean, no problem. I think it's probably going to be us sort of figuring it out with you here. Yeah. Like, there's definitely a lot of the best practices. Like, a lot of it is if we were building a hello world application here, it would probably be, very easy to say, oh, follow all these best practices. It's harder to say, hey, here's an application that's been written for months, years, whatever. And we've had, a build system that's already sort of, doing all these things. But it's interesting you bring up Google Cloud Build, because there's some discussion there around like, hey, with SSF, could we work with Google Cloud Build team to sort of figure out, like, can we integrate somewhere around there and some of that sort of stuff. And so, yeah, there's definitely practical areas there that we can kind of go through. And then I think what's also important is, you're bringing up all the right things in the conversations we've had, which is just like, hey, looking at GitHub, right, there's Salsa says 2-person code review, but whoever owns the repo can just sort of change the rules and change it back. And to be clear, there is an open GitHub issue for Salsa describing that, also describing the issue with like sock puppet accounts. Like there's nothing to prevent somebody from having 100 users that are all technically owned by them and just sort of saying, yep, it looks like there's 100 people who work on this project. These are things that from the Salsa side, we're trying to kind of figure out, which there's probably going to be a set of rules that make sense for closed source projects, like that you imagine like, hey, you have an HR team. That HR team has, is giving background checks and whatever. They know that you're not just 5 people, you're not posing as 5 different people. So there's definitely things that can be done on that end, but when it comes to some of the open source stuff, it's definitely a little bit more of a complicated situation, and one where I think there's needs to be more effort. And I think these are things that are worthwhile from the Salsa side to kind of like bring up. Hey, we would love to be able to kind of do this thing. We can, the very least, and in fact, actually, without getting into too many details, there is the potential that we might remove the 2-person code review from being a requirement because of that very reason of like, right now, it's very difficult to do that. We might recommend it purely from the standpoint of, hey, if you have a way of identifying that these are actual different humans, definitely do that. But there might also be ways of still doing something akin to that, through other modes of operation. One of the things that was sort of talked about was we can, in the very least, if folks are using approved hardware, right? Like with a TPM and those sorts of things, you could be pretty much say, well, in the very least, I know this was written on different pieces of hardware. There's lots of different things that people are sort of chatting through. I'm not going to go too deep down that right now. But I think on this end, to kind of talk maybe a little bit more practically, what sorts of things would you want? Like if you were to say, okay, great, we want to secure our supply chain, we want to secure our build to make sure that, the goals here are, one is you want to make sure that whatever you're ingesting safely, right, and securely, which means, hey, as much as you can, you want to ingest only safe stuff. And even if you do ingest something that eventually is determined to have like a log4j sort of situation, like, oh, something's bad with this dependency, you want to know like, yep, it's in there and we're exposed to it. Or no, it's in there, but we're not exposed to it, or whatever. That's one big thing. And then the second big thing I think is making sure that also whatever you're built, when you're building your software, you have largely, that the source code led to the output, that nothing in the middle has come in and just messed with it, right? I think those are the 2 main goals. So what can we do to sort of help you out there?
Sure. I think you touched on something there that actually I've bumped on a bit when I've been trying to do stuff with the project, which is like, you mentioned like in a business, you have like an HR department that can say, oh, this person works for us and that's fine. They're allowed to review code. And open source, obviously that's tricky. For Cert Manager at the moment, effectively, we have a Google group. And if you're in that Google group, you're a maintainer. And sort of it's very ad hoc because the team is 9-10 people maybe. So like you can totally just join that Google group. We can agree to add you to the Google group rather. You join it and then we'll just add you to the GitHub org and all that. And that kind of works as a sort of very simple solution to this. But obviously there's no automation around that. So if someone leaves, which isn't something we've had to deal with particularly, but if someone left, you need to sort of revoke their access and you end up sort of rebuilding like a business style joiners, movers, leavers AD system almost, where you want to automate all this stuff, but we're in the business of making certs for Kubernetes. We're not wanting to build AD for open source.
Yeah.
It feels like we're sort of, we don't want to reinvent the wheel though. We feel like some projects must have solved this. And like, where do we go with that? Like, how do we even approach that problem and solve that trust And the other stuff is sort of like more general access. Like if our builds are running in our Google Cloud project, that happens to be where they've always been run, and they're in the CNCF Google Cloud organization, then the CNCF admins can get access to our builds, right? Like we as maintainers, we can verify that a given build produced a given artifact pretty well because we can check the inputs and all the logs on Google Cloud Build, and that's hard to fake. But like the CNCF admins could totally just go in and change things, and where does that leave us? Like where does their access leave us? So we kind of just have to trust them, and is that okay? Like we think it probably is. It's a worthwhile trade to make, but it's hard to know how high we can go up on like the Salsa rankings while stuff like that is in place as an open source project.
Yeah, I think you bring up a lot of good points. Stuff that I think is worthwhile to, I think, even sort of write up as a little bit of a case study here as we're kind of building this out with you to kind of say, hey, here's the things we're concerned about, right? Like if a CNCF admin goes rogue, they can change a lot of things. And so actually that's another thing that there's an open GitHub issue for Salsa for, which is this idea around like, even if we can't prevent it, can we detect it? So that's a big thing that's being discussed, for example, with GitHub and with some of the other sorts of like Google Cloud Build. Can we, for example, say, hey, Google Cloud Build, and once again, this is how deep how deep do the turtles go? I think is sort of the thing that is being discussed here, is because once again, like even if you could prevent the them from changing something, you are still implicitly trusting Google to now, like, their build is doing what it says it's doing, right? And if you trust Google, right, is the hardware that Google is using, like, was that somehow compromised? And at some point you have to say, okay, great, we're trusting somebody, and it's about who we trust. But I think the thing that's super useful there is what can we, even if we do trust you, what can we do to sort of at least verify, get some additional information where it would require so many different people colluding in order to make something bad happen. And I think one of the things that's kind of interesting on that front is there's some discussions about, can somebody almost like, similar to what Shripad was showing before, is like, can I get almost like a signature of the build? Like the inputs of the build, right? Can we take a snapshot of what the Google Cloud parameters were, right? So like the API from Google Cloud is saying, hey, this is the configuration of the build. These were the inputs of the build, and so on and so forth. And assuming that, the parties in place that are there are signing off correctly, you at least know if somebody did change a parameter, it's in that attestation. So you could go back and say, this is weird. This shouldn't have been changed. What happened? And I think that sort of thing is kind of important there. And so a lot of times it's about setting up also sometimes different trust domains. So for example, you might say anybody can be, let's say, a maintainer of the code, but a handful of folks who have, let's say, been at, who have been working on Cert Manager for at least, 6 months, who, have a good history and blah, blah, blah. Maybe they are allowed to kind of raise up in the ranks, and they are able to kind of go to the build, the build configuration, repo or whatever, and be able to change stuff there. And then you still have a record in that repo of if somebody changes a build parameter, or, and by that I mean like a high level build parameter of like, oh, I want to remove this build step that checks, checks for security vulnerabilities. Oh, that's weird. And you'd have some sort of way of being able to check that. I think those are at a high level the sorts of things I think we're trying to kind of do, which is like, it's at the end of the day, supply chain security is about like, who do you trust and why do you trust them? And so, as much as you can, like when it comes to open source, where the thing that we've been sort of throwing around is like, supply chain security a lot of the time is you go to a restaurant, you see the health report, the and like, oh, okay, somebody's inspected this restaurant, seems to be pretty good. Whereas if somebody off the street just, granted, like just hands you a sandwich, you might be like, well, I don't know. But you can imagine like, hey, there's different groups that are out there, and so how do you sort of verify and trust those things, and how do you verify that they've stated the ingredients, but you also know that the FDA, at least in the US here, the FDA goes out and inspects farms and all these things for different diseases and so on. Right? Like, if something's been infected with salmonella, they can detect that, and they know from a supply chain perspective, oh, this affects all these folks. So I think there's like stuff on that end. There's also some conversations around, from the open source perspective, and this is another thing that we should probably chat through at some point, which is, OpenSSF with their Alpha Omega project is potentially looking at saying, hey, maybe the Linux Foundation will start to create like a group that is focused on builds, right? So they will say, hey, look, as opposed to you necessarily having 100% access of your build, maybe you give up some of that access to some security team or whatever. There's a bunch of different things out there. Or you might have, say, like, hey, we'll build our software, but in addition to that, OpenSSF will also build our stuff in parallel. And if they detect major differences, oh no, like somebody's done something bad. Like there's all sorts of ways that this can go. And I know we've been ranting here for a while here, but I think on that end, probably makes sense to maybe start like a once a week kind of sync up, see where we can kind of go through. If there's folks from this group who want to help out, feel free. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. And like I said in the chat, like there's a huge amount of parallels here with what we do as our bread and butter, like the trust and what have you. Yeah, I absolutely would be keen to do something like that, set up a sync and like have a chat about this stuff regularly. I'd say maybe after KubeCon, look at getting something set up. Like I don't think we're going to be starting anything in the very, very near term. This is kind of looking towards the future, but maybe sort of in a month's time, maybe reconnect and sort of have a look at setting something up. I can reach out to you, Michael, if that works.
Sure. Yeah. Makes sense to me, and I think before that, I'll probably write up a few things of like, what are the things we would sort of expect, just to sort of like chat through, like, hey, probably stuff like, what are the details of your build now? Where does that live? How do you verify maintainers? And I think almost like creating like a questionnaire based on the best practices and based on SLSA, just to kind of go through. And I think that would also help out from a deliverable perspective, so that when people are saying, okay, great, we want to do SLSA, how do we start? Yeah. Okay, here's a questionnaire, and then here's where you'd probably go. Cool.
Yeah, I'll feel free to ping me on Slack or anything like that. I can definitely take a look at anything like that.
Yeah.
And, I'll keep in touch.
Okay. That's good. I know we only have 3 minutes left. Any other questions, comments on this, on anything? I know it sounds like we're probably going to be canceling with the next 2 weeks worth of meetings because of KubeCon. Anything else? Cool. All right, everybody. See you all in a few weeks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Cheers, guys. Thank you all.